Here are the first 16 measures of one of Mozart's weirdest compositions, played on a replica of a period instrument. This passage begins and ends like any typical 18th century minuet. But then we get these unexpectedly loud and dissonant chords on the downbeats of measures 5, 7, and 9. To me, this sounds like the dancers stepping on each other's toes, but that's just my personal headcanon. Each of these chords is an augmented triad, which means that they are major triads but with a chromatically raised fifth. That type of chord is not especially common in the 18th century, so it is noteworthy that Mozart is throwing it in our faces like this. Mozart uses 3 different augmented triads, the first with the notes D, F sharp, and A sharp, the second with C, E, and G sharp, and the third with F, A, and C sharp. In fact, there is only one other augmented triad possible, and Mozart sneakily included it back in the first measure, G, B, and D sharp. These 4 3-note chords together comprise all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. Any other augmented triad that you could try to come up with would simply be an enharmonic respelling of one of these 4, which means that Mozart went out of his way not just to include the augmented triad for its unique character, but he made sure to use every possible augmented triad within the main theme of the minuet. This approach to composition, where the composer takes a symmetrical chord and transposes it around to fill in the chromatic aggregate, is much more characteristic of the modernist music of the early 20th century. Here's an example by Bela Bartok, where the composer transposes the augmented triad into 3 out of its 4 possible positions. He breaks the pattern in the 4th measure, which only has a B flat instead of a complete augmented triad. But then in the analogous location in measure 8, Bartok gives us F sharp. The only note missing to complete the whole pattern is D natural, but Bartok chooses to set up the pattern without completing it, which might have been too obvious or too symmetrical. Of course, this type of abstract pattern is much easier to execute in a post-tonal context. In a tonal piece of music, you can't just throw in a dissonant chord like an augmented triad anywhere you want. The dissonance needs to be prepared and resolved according to the rules of counterpoint and thorough-bass. Luckily, we know pretty much exactly how augmented triads were expected to behave conventionally in Mozart's time period, as we have a textbook written by Albrechtsberger in Vienna that is almost exactly contemporaneous with this piece of music, that teaches the voice leading of augmented triads. Albrechtsberger breaks augmented fifth chords into 2 basic types. In the first example, he shows how the raised fifth of a major triad can function as a passing tone, moving by step through the weak part of the measure. Albrechtsberger then shows the other basic voice-leading situation that causes augmented fifths, which is an upward resolving suspension that delays a leading tone resolution over a minor triad in first inversion. Albrechtsberger points out that this is a lot less common than the passing function augmented fifth, and that upward resolving suspensions like this are usually accompanied by downward resolving suspensions in the other voices, which is what he shows next. A chord with a suspended augmented fifth and a suspended seventh. And then a chord with suspended augmented fifth, seventh, and ninth. By the way, these two basic forms of the augmented fifth chord are not exclusive to Albrechtsberger's textbook. You can find examples with almost identical voice leading from Thurabase textbooks by C.P.E. Bach from the 1750s and Anton Bruckner from the 1860s. Mozart placed his augmented triads in a sequence where the exact same two-measure phrase is repeated but transposed. However, when we look closer at the voice leading, we can see that the three dissonant chords actually behave differently, and in ways that don't line up perfectly with the textbook use of the chord. Let's listen to the passage again to have it fresh in our ears. Measures 4 to 5 sound an awful lot like a dominant chord resolving to the tonic, except that the tonic triad has that augmented fifth. We can hear this use of the augmented fifth as an accented passing tone in the tenor voice, progressing from the A natural in measure 4 through A sharp on the downbeat to B, and then to B sharp, forming an augmented sixth chord on the last beat of the measure. Thurabase textbooks typically only show passing function occurring on the weak beat of a measure, like in the Albrechtsberger example. But accented passing tones were also a well-known type of dissonance in Thurabase and counterpoint. On the upbeat of measure 6, we have a B dominant seventh chord, and lo and behold, that is the same chord we arrive at on the downbeat of measure 8. So, unlike the first augmented fifth chord, this one in measure 7 does not lead into a new harmony, but instead prolongs the B chord. The function here is of an accented neighbor chord, where the G sharp in the tenor came from A natural and then returns to it by step, and the bass note C natural is an upper neighbor to the bass note B. Albrechtsberger did not mention neighboring function at all in his examples, and of the three augmented triads, this one sounds the most dissonant to my ears, simply because of its context. The last augmented fifth comes about as an A dominant seventh chord on the last beat of measure 8, appears to move to a D minor triad in first inversion on the downbeat of measure 9. The C sharp that forms the augmented fifth was the leading tone of the previous chord, and so this voice leading can be interpreted as an irregular suspension, where the suspended C sharp is prepared in a different voice and resolves upward, like in the Albrechtsberger example. I explained these kinds of irregular suspensions in greater detail in the video on how to compose auxiliary chords. So, the takeaway here is that not only is Mozart using lots of augmented triads, he also systematically uses every possible augmented triad and in as many different, weird ways that he can come up with. In an analysis of this piece, the composer and musicologist Howard Boatwright wrote that if a sonority can function as a compositional element in the same way a melodic or rhythmic motive can, then the augmented triad is a harmonic motive in this piece. The idea of a harmonic motive is not completely new, but it is noteworthy that Boatwright is claiming it exists in repertoire as early as Mozart. The most famous example of a harmonic motive is the Tristan chord, which even has its own Wikipedia page. Here it is in the opening measures of the orchestral prelude. And then about 4 or 5 hours later, here it is again at the very last cadence of the work, reinterpreted into a new key area and voice leading context. As a concluding thought, we might ask to what extent this minuet was a one-shot experiment on Mozart's part, or whether this kind of play with motivic dissonances might have been a regular feature in his music. Along these lines, Joseph Straus has recently pointed out a suggestive interpretation of the dissonance in the first antecedent phrase of this famous Mozart sonata. The trichord B, D, and E is first given as a very brief neighbor note figure at the beginning of the theme. This dissonant trichord is not as attention-grabbing as the augmented triad or the Tristan chord, but it has enough character to form a design, a little bit like a recurring pattern in a wallpaper. Mozart then revisits the same configuration of notes in the second measure, but now serving as a longer-ranging middle ground passing dissonance. Finally, in the fourth measure, Mozart adds a beautiful appoggiatura note E in the melody that allows him to form the same trichord in yet another voice-leading context. I buy it, but others might find this too much of a stretch. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.